Good morning. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. It's a really great turnout on a really important issue, and I'm just heartened to see so many people here for this important conversation. I want to welcome you here to the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I'm Laura Rosenberger, Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy here at GMF. As an organization dedicated to strengthening transatlantic cooperation on regional, national, and global challenges and opportunities in the spirit of the Marshall Plan, GMF has always been at the forefront of tackling transatlantic challenges and protecting the principles of democracy, good governance, and rule of law. That's why we launched the Alliance for Securing Democracy here at GMF last summer in recognition of the need for a bipartisan transatlantic effort to understand the asymmetric tools that Russia and potentially other states are using to undermine democracies and to develop new strategies to defend against and deter such activities. While the threat of foreign interference in our democracy may seem new to many Americans, our European partners and allies are all too familiar with these activities. And as Senator Cardin highlights in the report that he'll be discussing today, there are many lessons that we can learn from others who have experience in countering these activities. Standing together as democracies across the Atlantic will be the surest way to preserve that foundation of our strength. We also know that Putin uses a range of asymmetric tools, and we need to look at them comprehensively as a toolkit and counter the full range of those activities. These tools are evolving, and as the U.S. intelligence community assessment of Russia's interference in the 2016 election, which was released just over a year ago, assessed, Moscow will apply lessons learned from its Putin-ordered campaign aimed at the U.S. presidential election to future influence efforts worldwide. Moreover, we know that Russia's efforts to undermine our democracy have not stopped as Russian-oriented networks on social media continue to inject and amplify vitriol in our daily discourse, trying to turn Americans against one another. It's therefore essential that we come together across party lines to defend our democracy. This is, I know all of us here today believe, a national security imperative. The Alliance's co-director, Jamie Fly, and I outlined a bipartisan approach to this challenge in our recent Democracy Journal article on Shredding the Putin Playbook. But time is not on our side, and we need to take meaningful action along with our partners and allies. And so it is a privilege to host key figures from across party lines who are leading efforts to counter the threat. And I can't think of a better moderator for that conversation than former Secretary of Homeland Security Michael Chertoff, who we are honored to have as a member of the Alliance for Securing Democracy's Advisory Council. Secretary Chertoff is a leading voice on cybersecurity issues and has championed the need for more effective measures to counter Russia's asymmetric efforts to undermine democracy in the U.S. and Europe. Secretary Chertoff will later introduce Congressman Will Hurd, who will join us shortly and is a leading voice in the House on the need for meaningful action to counter Russia's efforts to undermine democracies. But first, we'll hear from Senator Cardin about the important report he is launching today highlighting these issues. I know we will all learn a great deal from it. Senator Cardin was elected by the people of Maryland to the Senate in 2006 after nearly 2 decades in the House. As ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, he has worked across party lines to further our national security and protect universal human rights. He has fought to ensure that anti-corruption, transparency, and respect for human rights are integrated into our foreign policy, including through his championship of the Magnitsky Act and the Global Magnitsky Act. Among a number of roles, he has been a commissioner on the U.S. Helsinki Commission and ranking member of the SFRC East Asia, Pacific, and International Cybersecurity Policy Subcommittee. Senator Cardin, it is my privilege to welcome you today.
Thanks, Laura. Laura, thank you very much for that very generous introduction, but more importantly, thank you for the great work you're doing for the Alliance for Security Democracy. I also want to thank the German Marshall Fund, Karen Donfried, for her leadership and work here at the German Marshall Fund. It's been an incredible asset on the transatlantic relationships and encouraging dialogue and support for democratic institutions. And it's good to be here with Mike Chertoff. He's done an incredible service to our country, and it's an honor to be here with you, Michael. I know that you will hear from Representative Will Hurd later, who's been one of the leading forces in the House against Russia's malign influence. So I hope that you will understand that our concern about Russia's behavior is a bipartisan concern or a nonpartisan concern, one of great interest to our national security. The Alliance for Security Democracy that Laura talked about with Jamie Fly is an effort to bring to the attention of the American people, the public, what Russia's threat is all about. to our democratic institutions. So it's a great lead into why we did this report, which I am releasing today on behalf of the Democratic members of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Putin's asymmetric assault on democracy in Russia and Europe, implications for U.S. national security. This is the report that we are releasing today. It's about 200 pages, exactly 200 pages. How do we do that? But anyway, just shows you how well we plan in advance. I asked for about a 200-page report. We got it. We're releasing it today, and I first want to acknowledge the incredible work of the staff to put this together over the last year. This was an effort that was a great deal of compiling information, interviewing, working with people from other countries, government representatives. Damian Murphy led the effort on our staff, and I thank him for his professionalism and his dedication to this task. He had able help from Terrell Henry and Laura Carey, and I thank both of them for their extraordinary work. Megan Barkley also contributed to this report, and it would not have been possible without the leadership of our staff director, Jessica Lewis. So I just want to acknowledge my name may be on this report, but it represents the professionalism and dedication of our staff people. I'm frequently asked, why is this not a report from the full Senate Foreign Relations Committee? So let me try to explain that from the beginning, because this is not a partisan report, and it's a report that I expect will be embraced by both Democrats and Republicans in the United States Congress. We had to make a decision early in 2017 as to devoting the staff resources and time in order to put this together, because it was going to be a tremendous effort to get this comprehensive report done. And we recognize the importance of presenting to the American people a comprehensive understanding of what Russia's game plan is. We knew after the 2016 elections that we were vulnerable. But the 2016 elections was just a small part of Russia's overall design to try to, Mr. Putin's design, to try to compromise democratic institutions. And we knew that we had to start. So we immediately informed the Republican staff and Senator Corker our game plan, what we were doing. And we kept them engaged and informed as we went through the process. So this is not an effort to exclude one party. In fact, much of what is in this report was with the assistance of Republican members. So I just want that to be clear, and we expect that this report will be embraced for the seriousness that it exposes on Russia's behavior. Russia's government interference in 19 countries are outlined in this report. And we are prepared to move forward. This is not a partisan issue. There is a long tradition in Congress of Republicans and Democrats working together to counter Russia government aggression abroad and abuse against its own citizens, our allies, and democratic institutions. The sanctions bill that Congress passed in 2017 was with near unanimous support is a reflection of that tradition. I was proud to work on that legislation with a team that included the likes as Republican Senators John McCain, Lindsey Graham, and Marco Rubio, as well as Democratic Senators Bob Menendez, Jeanne Shaheen, and Dick Durbin. The strength and durability of our own political system relies on such bipartisan solutions to our national security challenges. And I think those of you who have been covering the Senate Foreign Relations Committee know that Senator Corker and I work together, not in a partisan manner, in a nonpartisan manner, in order to advance the priorities of our country. And we have certainly done that in regards to the threat that Russia poses to the United States. During the Cold War, Colonel Rolf Wagenbreth, a longtime head of the active measures operations from the East German Stasi, reportedly said, "A powerful adversary can only be defeated through a sophisticated, methodological, careful, and shrewd effort to exploit even the smallest cracks between our enemies and within their elite." Now, that was during the Cold War, and the colonel would have used traditional media and methods to exploit these smallest cracks. It would have indeed been methodical, careful, and slow. He could never have imagined the havoc wreaked by today's modern technology tools of the internet. The speed and sophistication of these weapons have allowed his like-minded brethren in Moscow today to take this technique to scales and make an outsized impact on democratic institutions around the world. Today, the government of the Russian Federation is engaged in relentless assaults against democratic institutions, universal values, and the rule of law, at home and abroad. President Vladimir Putin directs these attacks with an asymmetric arsenal: cyber attacks, disinformation, support for fringe political groups, the weaponization of energy resources, organized crime and corruption, and military aggression. Why does he use these tools? Because he's weak. He's not 10 feet tall, nor should we make him out to be. His economy is faltering, his military remains substandard, and he has few adherents around the world. Russia's economy ranks number 12 in the world. It is 7% the size of the U.S. economy. It's smaller than countries such as Italy, South Korea, or Canada. He is forced to resort to such techniques because that's all he has. And due to some measure of success, especially in 2016, his attacks have grown in intensity and complexity over the last few years. With every attack, he's learning and honing his techniques. This began well before the Trump administration, this design. This is not just something that all of a sudden started in 2017. According to the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project, Mr. Putin has accumulated tens of billions of dollars in stolen wealth. He has an active and effective propaganda machine. He has tried to splinter the EU in key ways, like internet trolls crowding the public dialogue on Brexit in the UK and slowing Serbia's integration talks with the European Union. And he's been able to stall progress in Georgia and Ukraine's secession into NATO through aggressive military incursions and occupations. We got to acknowledge the effectiveness of these tools. It brought Mr. Putin to power in Russia, the use of these tools. These techniques were first developed at home against the Russian people, and now Mr. Putin is using them globally. Through our analysis, it became clear that several European countries have stepped up to the challenge. For some in Europe, the 2016 U.S. elections was a wake-up call, which led to political resolve and action. For others, the threat of these Russian tools have been present for decades, and they have organized accordingly. We learned through this investigation that the asymmetric arsenal can be countered with the right mixture of political will, defense, and deterrence. The countries that have achieved a degree of success all have one thing in common: political leadership who publicly said enough is enough, and from there mobilized their bureaucracies to respond. This unfortunately stands in sharp contrast to our current situation in the United States. Following attacks like Pearl Harbor, 9/11, U.S. presidents have rallied the country and the world to address the challenges facing the nation. Yet today, the current president of the United States still barely acknowledges the threat posed by Mr. Putin's repeated attacks on democratic governments and institutions, let alone exercises the kind of leadership history has shown is necessary to effectively counter this kind of aggression. Never before has a U.S. president so clearly ignored such a grave threat and a growing threat to U.S. national security. And we have to be careful not to confuse President Trump's inaction with the patriotism of our many honorable career and political public servants in government who are clear-eyed about the Kremlin threat and doing their best to respond. They are trying to implement the sanctions laws on Russia. They are trying to provide assistance that bolsters democratic institutions abroad. They are strengthening our military presence in Europe and helping to defend our friends in NATO. Intelligence, national security, and law enforcement officials work day and night to protect us. I hope that this report can offer a constructive policy path forward and space to implement it for those in government who acknowledge the threat. And I draw inspiration from Europe. Many valuable lessons can be drawn from our friends there. Let me highlight just a few examples. France has fostered a strong cooperation between government, political, and media actors to blunt the impact of the Kremlin's cyber hacking and smear campaigns. In response to what French authorities view as possible Russia effort to hack the digital infrastructure of political campaigns, France's main cybersecurity agency, the French Network of an Information Security Agency, warned all political parties about the Russia cyber threat in the fall of 2016. That agency subsequently offered cybersecurity awareness and training seminars for all French political parties ahead of the French election this past spring. All parties participated, with the understandable exception of the Front National, and we understand why they declined. The Macron campaign was a clear target of Russia's hacked emails, which leaked these emails shortly before the runoff elections. France was prepared for that attack. The UK has made a public point to chastise Mr. Putin for his meddling in democracies and move to strengthen cybersecurity and electoral procedures. They understand that Russia was actively engaged in the UK with Twitter accounts during the Brexit referendum. The Baltic states have diversified energy supplies, informed their public about the activities of Russia's security services, and strengthened defenses against cyber attacks and disinformation. The Nordic countries have been particularly good on focusing on their individual citizens and empowering them with the critical thinking skills to fight disinformation. For example, Sweden incorporated into its primary schools a curriculum to teach digital competency, including how to differentiate between reliable and unreliable sources. Even Bamse, the bear, one of Sweden's most popular cartoon characters, has been recruited to help children learn about the dangers of fake news and the need to cross-check sources of information. And in Germany, all political parties in 2016, except, you guessed it, AfD, agreed not to use bots and paid trolls in their campaigning. Chancellor Merkel warned in a major address of the threat of fake news and disinformation tactics. The Interior Ministry also proposed the creation of a Center of Defense Against Misinformation, noting that Russian Germans and people of Turkish origin are especially susceptible of disinformation, and recommended an intensification of political educational work with those groups. I think most of you are familiar with the Lisa case that appeared in Germany, of fake news created by a Russian state TV that was aimed at the Russian German-speaking population to incite them to protest against migrants. Here in the United States, we must respond with urgency to this threat. If we don't, the regime in Moscow will be emboldened to undermine European stability again, and the United States interfere in our midterm elections of 2018 and our presidential elections of 2020. Make no mistake about it. Mr. Putin will push as far as he's allowed to push if we don't push back. Even beyond electoral interference, the report also found examples of Kremlin-backed efforts that impact the daily lives of Americans as things they care about. For example, cheating Americans out of medals at the Olympic Games, supporting cyber criminals who attack American businesses and who steal the financial information of millions of American consumers. So what should we do about this? What should we do about to counter Russia's asymmetrical arsenal? The report includes many recommendations, but I would like to summarize the top 6. First, Mr. Trump must show unequivocal presidential leadership to mobilize our government and the American people. He should immediately declare that it's a U.S. policy to counter and deter all forms of Russia hybrid threats against the United States and around the world. The President should establish a high-level interagency fusion cell modeled on the National Counterterrorism Center to coordinate all elements of U.S. policy and programming in response to the Russian government's malign influence operations. Second, the U.S. government should provide assistance in concert with allies in Europe to build democratic institutions within those European and Eurasian states most vulnerable to Russia government's interference. Democracies with transparent governments, the rule of law, a free media, engaged citizens are naturally more resilient to Mr. Putin's asymmetric arsenal. As part of this effort, the United States government should lead an international effort of like-minded democracies to build awareness of and resilience to the Kremlin's malign influence operations. Specifically, the President should convene an annual global summit of hybrid threats modeled on the Global Coalition to Counter ISIL or the Countering Violent Extremism summits that have taken place since 2015. Civil societies and private sector should participate in the summits and the follow-up activities. To reinforce these efforts, the United States government should demonstrate clear and sustained diplomatic leadership in support of individual human rights that form the backbone of our democratic system. Members of the United States Congress have a clear responsibility to show U.S. leadership on values by making democracy and human rights a central part of their agenda. They should conduct hearings and use other platforms and opportunities to publicly advance these issues. I am proud of the record of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in this regard in highlighting human rights and bringing these issues to the public attention and the actions that we've taken in passing legislation. And I thank Senator Corker for his leadership on this, but we must do more. Third, the U.S. and our allies should expose and freeze Kremlin-linked dirty money. Corruption provides the motivation and the means for many of the Kremlin's malign influence operations. These are criminal enterprises. The U.S. Treasury Department should make public any intelligence related to Mr. Putin's personal corruption and wealth stored abroad and take steps with our European allies to cut off Mr. Putin and his inner circle from the international financial system. They want dollars, not rubles. And by the way, they want visas to visit other countries and not be stuck in Russia. That's why the Magnitsky Law really worked, by taking away the fruits of their corruption. The U.S. government should also expose corrupt and criminal activities associated with Russia's state-owned energy sector. In addition, the United States government should also issue yearly reports that assign tiered classification based on objective third-party corruption indicators, as well as governmental efforts to combat corruption. This is a bill that's already passed the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's a bill that's patterned after the Trafficking in Persons report that judges every country's efforts to fight modern-day slavery. We need the same effort as far as countries are prepared to fight corruption. Fourth, the United States government should designate countries that employ malign influence operations to assault democracies as state hybrid threat actors. Countries that are so designated as such would fall under a preemptive and escalating sanction regime that would be applied whenever the state uses asymmetric weapons like cyber attacks to interfere with a democratic election or disrupt a country's critical infrastructure. The United States government should work with EU to ensure that these sanctions are coordinated and effective. The United States government should also produce yearly public reports that detail the Russian government's malign influence operations in the United States and around the world. Fifth, the United States and NATO should lead a coalition of countries committed to mutual defense against cyber attacks, to include the establishment of a rapid reaction teams to defend allies under attack. The U.S. government should also call a special meeting of NATO heads of state to review the extent of Russia government-sponsored cyber attacks among states and develop a formal guideline as to how the alliance will consider such an attacks in context of NATO's Article 5 collective defense provisions. The United States government should also lead an effort to establish an international treaty on the use of cyber tools in peacetime, modeled on international arms control treaties. And finally, the United States and European governments should mandate that social media companies make public the sources of funding for political advertisement along the same lines as TV channels and print media. Social media companies should conduct comprehensive audits on how their platforms may have been used by Kremlin-linked entities to influence elections occurring over the past several years, and should establish civil society advisory councils to provide input and warnings about emerging disinformation trends and government suppression. They should work with foundations, governments, and civil societies to promote media literacy and reduce the presence of disinformation on their platform. Following the end of World War II, the United States led the world in constructing the liberal international order, underpinned by democratic institutions, shared values, and accepted norms. The enduring transatlantic bond between America and Europe, embodied in organizations like the German Marshall Fund, is the foundation for that order. It protects our shared security, advances our interests, and expands our prosperity. Yet the defense of that system and of institutions and democratic principles is an anathema to Mr. Putin, who seeks to protect little more than his power and wealth. It's therefore up to the United States and our allies to engage in a coordinated effort to counter the Kremlin's assault on democracy in Europe, the United States, and around the world. In closing, we must take care to point out that there is a distinction between Mr. Putin's corrupt regime and the people of Russia, who have been some of the most frequent victims. Many Russian citizens strive for a transparent, accountable government that operates under the democratic rule of law, and we hold hope for better relations in the future with Russia. We applaud the courage that we've recently seen of those who have protested on the streets of Moscow and throughout Russia to speak out against Mr. Putin's policies. I always remember some of the most human rights activists who continuously tell us, Russians, that the passage by the United States Congress of the Magnitsky Law was the most pro-Russia law that we could have passed because it spoke in favor of the Russian people. As pointed out by Laura, I also am active in the U.S. Helsinki Commission. Russia and the United States are members of the OSCE. We've made a mutual commitment to respect the rights of our citizens, and we have a right to challenge when a country is not complying with the Helsinki commitments. That's our responsibility. The United States must work with our allies to build defenses against Mr. Putin's asymmetric arsenal and strengthen international norms and values to deter such malign behavior by Russia or any other country. That's the essence of what we're recommending in this report. It's now time for the United States to exercise leadership. Thank you.
Great. Well, Senator, thank you for those remarks. Thank you for your leadership in getting at this very comprehensive and informative report. And I think what we'll do now is maybe I'll ask a couple of questions, and then afterwards we'll throw it open to the audience. And I know you have a hard stop to leave here 5 minutes before the hour. You know, what's interesting about this report is much of the public dialogue in this country about Russian interference has been about fake news and did somebody hack into the election process itself, which, at least as far as I know, happily did not happen. But you point out that Russian activities are much broader than that. It involves the use of investments overseas in Europe, for example, to leverage in order to favor Russian interests. It involves the use of energy as a way of, again, exerting economic leverage. There is corruption, there are cyber attacks. We saw that in Estonia in 2007 and Georgia in 2008. So there's a larger playbook of hybrid warfare. You talked about bringing everything together in a kind of a fusion cell and having a strategy. And can you give us a little bit of a sense of your vision about how this would work?
Well, thank you for the question. We concentrate on a particular episode rather than on the plan that Russia has against democratic institutions. So when Russia attacks the U.S. elections, we get excited about that. We have investigations going on about it. We try to see how we can protect ourselves against that particular attack. Or when Russia invades Ukraine, we take action because we say, well, we take action as if that's an isolated episode. When it's not an isolated episode, it's part of an overall design that Mr. Putin has, which recognizes that democratic countries that have the rule of law, countries that have free and fair elections, are against his personal interest. He can't go in those countries and commit the same type of criminal behavior that he can in his own country. There's concerns that these countries will impose sanctions against his economy, and some of them have. So he wants to bring that down. He also wants to be as popular as he can with his own people, and he uses propaganda to do that. I envision the fusion cell, the interagency committee, to take every resource we have, all of the areas, whether it's intelligence, whether it's defense, whether it's State Department, that put all that in together with a strategy as to how we deal with the overall plan. So the priorities may well be to join our Europeans, because the front lines may well be Europe rather than the United States, as it is. And the front lines in Europe are countries that have prior connections to the Soviet Union. So we need to develop that type of strategy working in coalition, and this interagency cell would develop that type of an overall strategy and would be responsible for all players participating and having a strategy to carry out the U.S. policy.
Now, let me ask this question. Back in the Cold War, when the Russians did propaganda, the objective eventually, I think, as fanciful as it was to get all the workers of the world to unite and join Russia. Obviously, that didn't work. What is Putin's objective here, though? He's not seeking to actually become the popular leader of other countries. What do you see his end game being?
Well, I think Mr. Putin is, first of all, trying to preserve his own popularity in a country where the economy is failing and therefore has to have other successes. The other successes may be military successes that are contrived so that he can show the people of Russia that he's been a successful warrior. It may be winning more medals in the Olympics than you should win if you played fairly. I mean, it's pride of the Russian people that he's trying to show through his activities. Number two, he needs money. Corruption and illegal funds are the grease that operate his operations. So that's an incredibly important part of his overall strategies. And then third, part of this, and it also I think deals with local popularity, he wants to be influential around the world. He wants Russia to be influential. So therefore, he finds ways through criminal organizations, through alliances that violate basic human rights. We've seen this in the Middle East. We see it obviously in Europe. He's showing much more influence, and so all that is part of his game plan. The only way he can accomplish that is by using this asymmetric arsenal of cyber attacks and energy weaponization, and in cases he uses also sponsoring criminal organizations.
Now, some of the reporting we've seen in recent months about the use of fake news by the Russians have been examples of exploiting existing social divisions, taking actual stories, real stories, and propagating them around in order to inflame populations, for example, on some of the issues involving police misconduct. That suggests that for Putin to be successful in planting seeds of discord, there has to be fertile ground. And that means our civil society obviously has a role to play in creating conditions that don't allow the fertilization by this kind of malevolent news. How do we engage civil society, but respect the fact that under our First Amendment, the government doesn't tell us what to say or what stories to run?
Well, it's a really challenging question you're asking, because there is discontent in all communities. The migrant issue has created resentment naturally. It's just a natural issue over the history of mankind. We've had problems with public acceptance of migrants. So, but what we have not had is another country coming into our country and exploiting that. That we have not had as a tool, as an effort to disrupt our government. That's what's happened with Russia, and that's what's unacceptable. It's the same thing we're talking about when we're trying to figure out the acceptable use of cyber for getting information or using it as a tool for national defense. There's a limit as to what you can do. And Mr. Putin has violated those international norms. So it is wrong to try to interfere with the domestic tranquility of a country for the purposes of causing lack of unity in Europe. That's one of his objectives, is to weaken EU. So the migrant issue gives him a really excellent opportunity to accomplish his objective. He certainly doesn't want the expansion of NATO. So having troops in Georgia, having troops in Ukraine makes it much more difficult for those countries to move towards NATO accession. So these are all part of his strategies to weaken Europe, to weaken the West in a way that goes over the edge of what is acceptable conduct.
Now, obviously, the Russians will look at what we're doing, and if, in fact, we implement some of the suggestions made in this report, they're obviously not simply going to walk away from the field of battle here. What do you see their reaction being? What ought we be anticipating down the line?
I expect that they're going to issue a 400-page report. So we found that when we passed the Magnitsky Law, they did their own list of people that couldn't visit their country. They'll do something as simplistic as that because part of Mr. Putin's strategy is that every country has these problems. Do we have corruption in our country? Yes, but every country has corruption. Are we doing something about it? Yes, we're rooting out. Look at all the indictments we brought. We even brought an indictment against Mr. Magnitsky after he died to show you how serious we are about fighting corruption. So they'll point to all that, but this is our country, and we're going to make sure that Russia's greatness is preserved. So that's the challenge that we have, and I think the Russian, Mr. Putin's response will be, we can put a bigger spotlight on your problems than you did us.
Well, let me throw it open to some questions. There's people with mics. If you just identify yourself and ask a question rather than make a statement. Yes, over there, the gentleman with the glasses.
Anders Åslund, the Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for this report that truly looks excellent. I would like to draw you out a little bit on your third point, the asset freeze. Much of this money is in this country. Probably most of the Russian money through anonymous companies, and the money comes in through law firms and real estate. 3 years ago, the U.S. Treasury assessed that $300 billion a year is laundered into this country. Do you have any idea about doing something about this also? Thank you.
Absolutely. We agree with you completely. We have problems because of our domestic laws. We protect privacy. We protect the free enterprise. So we have laws that work to Mr. Putin's advantage in hiding resources. We have shell companies that we don't have full reports on. We need to strengthen our laws, particularly as it relates to shell companies. Was suggested several years ago. Congress has yet to act on that. That's an area where I think we need to act. We call in our report for the administration to issue an annual report on Mr. Putin's illegal gains so that we can try to put up more of a spotlight on it. Much of it's in the United States, but there are other countries that also need to cooperate with us. And we need to make sure that our banking systems are not available for the use of those transfer funds.
Thank you. Yes.
Anders Stegmans, Latvian ambassador in Washington. Thank you very much, Center, for this brilliant report. The question is about, or maybe general relationship between U.S. and West to Russia. I would refer to the last Levada report about the enemies of Russia, where U.S. landed on a proud first place with 68% of Russian people considering U.S. is an enemy. Ukraine was number 2 with 29, and EU was number 3 with 14 only. How do you, well, you said we should make a distinction between administration and Russian people. Russian people, with vast majority, are considering Americans as enemies. Do you see, is it from Russian side come back to the relationship, to the spirit of Cold War time? Or do you see some kind of path of, well, settle up relations?
Well, first of all, I'm for as much people-to-people exchanges as we possibly can, because I think there's a lot of misinformation. And the more information we can share among the populace, I think the better off we are. So I think one of the cures to this is, as I said, I have no argument, no complaints against the people of Russia. They're good people. They have a proud history, and they should have a bright future. So I want to empower the people. The Soviet Union decided to join the OSCE. That was a voluntary decision that they made. There are certain fundamental commitments they made in the Helsinki Final Act that Russia now needs to comply with. These are basic fundamental rights for its citizens. In the Helsinki document, every signatory state has the obligation and the opportunity to question any other state. I've questioned activities in the United States where I thought that our conduct was not what it needed to be. That's what an open democratic society does. But Russia leadership is doing things with propaganda, etc., to get popular support that has been misleading its population. I honestly believe that we want to have and can have a good relationship with Russia. but it can't be with a country that tries to interfere in our elections. It can't be in a country that is trying to use energy as a weapon. It can't be in a country that invades its neighbors. That's not acceptable. So it's the conduct of its government that is causing the friction. And yes, you often root for the home team. And with the United States imposing sanctions against Russia, I expect the Russian people didn't like that. I understand it. I must tell you, we had the same problem with the apartheid South Africa. When the United States imposed sanctions against South Africa, it wasn't very popular with the people of South Africa. The international community followed suit. It was the right course for South Africa, for the people of South Africa. I think it's right for us to speak out on behalf of the Russian people, but the conduct of the Russian government needs to change.
Lady back there, yes.
My name is Corinne Roshani, and I'm from International Broadcasting Bureau, which oversees Voice of America and Radio Free Europe, so which were very successful in Cold War. And what do you think will be the role of those entities now in this whole big picture?
Of what entity?
Of Voice of America, and Radio Free Europe.
Voice of America has been strongly supported by the Congress. We don't speak to that directly in our report, but we do talk to the fact that we think dealing with information, the free press, is very, very important. The problem today is that people are insensitive to what is accurate and what is not accurate. And we have an attack on the free media in our own country as well as around the world. Voice of America offers information in many parts of the world where that's the only source of really true objective information.
Yes.
Good morning, Senator. Caroline Vicini, DCM at the European Union delegation here in Washington. Thank you for your words about the cooperation with Europe, something that we really welcome. And you know we stand ready at the European Union to work with the U.S. on this. And I appreciate your report. And you mentioned when you started out something that I think is quite fundamental, because you are suggesting some kind of a leadership role for the U.S. in this report on several international initiatives. But what do you think about the possibility to do that, really, in this current political climate in the U.S. and with, as you mentioned yourself, a president that barely recognizes that this is a threat?
Well, I would acknowledge that President Trump is unpredictable, that he conducts policy differently than any previous administration that I have ever been involved with. He is not only unpredictable to the members of Congress and to the American people, but to his own administration. So it's not an easy type of manner in which he operates. He has his style. I do believe that the American people and the Congress and his administration has changed his views during the course of this year. I think in regards to Russia, there's been a change in President Trump's views as it relates to Russia. So I think the president has been exposed to the realities of the challenges that we have, and is acting in a way to at least recognize some of these threats. Is he doing what I want him to do? No. I hope that the bipartisan efforts in Congress will help in that regard. To pass a bill 98-2 in the United States Senate was pretty remarkable. The president signed that bill. So I'm hopeful that we'll continue to see the United States evolve into strong leadership, working with Europe, which is critically important, to defend us against these types of attacks.
Yes, yes.
Good morning. Wolfgang Walden, Ambassador of Austria. My question goes a little bit in the similar direction to Caroline Vicini's. You mentioned this bipartisan nature of the report, of course, and then this fusion cell, as you called it, the interagency, this agency that should join all the efforts and develop the joint strategy together with the Europeans. what are the chances of success for establishing such an agency now, which needs bipartisanship, of course, given the nature of the discussion now and the maybe emerging lack of bipartisanship with regard to the Russian investigation? And do you have a specific roadmap or a specific steps already in mind for implementing this agency? Thank you.
Well, we've had pretty candid discussions with members of the Trump administration about this. We've had pretty candid discussions with the Europeans on it. We've had candid discussions with members of the Senate and House. I think there's a growing understanding of the recommendations in this report, including the interagency committee, that has broad bipartisan support. So I can't tell you what President Trump's going to do, what he'll embrace, what he won't embrace, how he will embrace it. But I do think there's strong bipartisan interest. I mentioned several of the Republican senators who I've worked with over the years on this, and it's been a broad group. So I think there's a general recognition that the U.S. leadership is indispensable to dealing with this security issue.
Yes.
My name is Gentry Lane. I'm with Zacchaeus Analytics, private sector. So here's my question. Our country has been the subject of a very vicious propaganda campaign. We're under attack, and all we have to show for it is, with all due respect, a 200-page report. We don't even have anyone in our office in science and technology. I don't see how this is going to get addressed anytime soon.
Okay, so understand the purpose of this report is to give the broader picture with the focus primarily Europe, but also the United States, of the activities of Mr. Putin and what we need to do to address that. There are other investigations that are going forward. There's other efforts that are being made, particularly as it relates to the direct attack in the United States. We have, as you know, we have Mr. Mueller's investigation. We have Intelligence Committee's investigations. So there's going to be some additional reports coming out that we hope will give us some additional recommendations on changes we need in order to protect ourselves. As we take those recommendations up, I think this report will also be helpful to say, okay, we can deal with that threat, but let's make sure we have the broader issues also on our radar screen. So I hear what you're saying, and I agree with you. To me, the Trump administration has not staffed and put the resources where they should be to deal with this threat. I agree with you on that.
I think we have time for one more question in the back there.
Morning, Senator. My name is Audra Gracia, also with Private Enterprise Wicker, a cybersecurity company. My question is, given our distinction between sort of official government taxpayer business and the fact that Russia, hacked our political institutions, what is Congress doing to help political institutions secure themselves as we approach the midterm elections?
Our elections?
Yes.
Well, every country has different election systems, so there's not one size that fits all. There's a common theme here. But as you know, the U.S. election system is one that is run by the states. In many cases, it's the counties that actually do the security, et cetera. We know that there has been some hacking interest as to how our voting system operates. So we know there is at least an effort being made to better understand how our system operates. We also know that there's been efforts made to understand that not every voter has the same impact on a result of an election. So where do you concentrate your resources? And we also know that they've used the social media, and that we have to protect against at least have disclosures on how the social media advertisement is done. We know all those different issues. So anticipating into 2018, we're urging that starting with the President and the Trump administration, that they work with each of our states and local governments to recognize the threats that are out there. We have one vulnerability that Europe doesn't have. We don't have an election cycle. We're always in election mode here. So that's more challenging to protect against that type of an open system that we have and a culture that we have that politics is always fair game. So we really do need to recognize that the 2018 elections started a year ago. And there may have already been some activities. So are we as prepared as we need to be? I don't believe so. But I do know that there is tremendous concerns. I know what's being done in Maryland. I know what's being done in other states. in order to protect the integrity of our election system, and additional steps have been taken.
Great. Well, listen, Senator, thank you very much.
Well, thank you all very much. Good to be here.
Thanks for the report. Great. Have a good trip. Very good. Well, listen, we are happy to be joined by Congressman Will Hurd. I'll give you just a little bit of a bio. Congressman Hurd represents the people of Texas, but we're not going to talk about the border in this meeting.
We can if you want.
It's all right. We've got our plates filled with the Russians. He served in a certain three-letter agency in various posts overseas, was then involved as a cybersecurity advisor in the private sector, and since 2015, he's been a member of Congress. He's on the Government Oversight and Reform Committee, the Homeland Security Committee, and the House Permanent Select Intelligence Committee. Congressman, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Before I start with a couple of questions, then we'll throw it open, let me just ask you, have you had an opportunity to look at the report that the Democratic staff and the Senate Intelligence Committee, Foreign Relations Committee issued on Russian involvement in various kinds of information operations?
So I haven't had a deep dive in it, but I'm fairly familiar with some of the broader precepts of it.
And just as a kind of a general overview, as you look at the kinds of issues we ought to be thinking about, what strike you as kind of the top priorities in terms of our engagement on the issue of Russian information operations and active measures, et cetera?
Well, it starts with what is our strategy in how to handle it, right? And that's why I think what the Alliance for Securing Democracy is doing is a good thing. I would, active measures, hybrid war, all of this is part of covert action. This is coming out of the intelligence community. I think of this as a community. I think of this as covert action. And, how do we counter that? Historically, if this was being done overseas, the CIA would be responsible for this. But the National Security Act of 1947 says the CIA can't do covert action in the United States of America, so they're not prepared for that. So who has the responsibility in dealing with this? And it's not just a public sector issue. We have to get the private sector, academia, and the press involved as well. And so there hasn't been enough conversation on who should do what are the roles, responsibilities in this effort. I think highlighting the problem is important. I think some of the social media companies highlighting the tactics, tools, and procedures that the Russians were using to try to erode trust in our democratic institutions were important. But I ultimately think the spearhead of this is going to have to be something between the State Department and Department of Homeland Security. And we can use the Countering Violent Extremism as a model because it's the same effort. It's just the messaging and the counter messaging is a little bit different.
Well, that's actually a very interesting point about countering violent extremism. For those who are not familiar with that term, that's been a strategy that we've had for some period of time to look at what makes people susceptible to being recruited by terrorists. And one of the things we were talking about a little bit earlier is some of what we've seen that the Russians have done to promote dissension really are seeds that are planted in ground that is fertile because of what we ourselves are doing.
Absolutely.
And so the first line of defense is us and how we wind up educating ourselves and preparing ourselves. If you can give us some sense of how you think we might do that using all of our institutions, sure, government, but also the private sector as well.
So it starts with what is Vladimir Putin trying to do? Vladimir Putin is ultimately trying to reestablish the territorial integrity of the USSR. And what is preventing him from doing that? EU, NATO, and the United States. Vladimir Putin knows that he can't beat us militarily. He knows he can't beat us economically. That's why they've had to resort to hybrid war. They've been perfecting this for 3 decades, and so one is a recognition of that problem. We need the private sector, the tools that the Russians are using. We need them to help identify when they see these trends. And I think that is what was helpful in the German and French elections after our elections, is because Twitter, Facebook, Google, everybody saw and were able to analyze the tactics that were being used and give that information to the Russians, to the Germans and the French. But what we also need to start doing is the intelligence services, the U.S. intelligence services, need to start sharing a little bit more with those sections. Because if you look at what the work Facebook has done on, the INA, or the Internet Research Agency, IRA,
right.
Excuse me, all that work has been done on their own.
Right, and that's just for everybody's edification. That's that agency in Russia that basically houses trolls.
For sure. And so if some of this information that's gathered by our intelligence services is able to be used by the private sector to continue to do their targeting and their review and their focus, I think we can be even more effective. So that is some very basic efforts. Also, we need to identify when something is wrong, right? How come we all know, don't get into a car with a stranger? We all know stranger danger, right? Why are you listening to a stranger on social media? And why do you think somebody you know nothing about, why do you think that information is valuable? And so that is such a basic, common body of knowledge thing that we have to start incorporating. Look, I took music class. I took a lot of history classes when I was a kid. I am neither a musician nor a historian. But we should be starting to educate how the internet works, how an idea gets propagated. We learn how a combustion engine works, but we don't know how the internet works and how these types of things. So we have to start educating at the very basic level. When my 1.5-year-old niece knows how to use an iPad, we got to start making sure she knows not only how to use that tool, but what the information is coming back to us.
Well, that's critical thinking. And, for years we've talked about the importance of teaching kids about people on the internet who might be trying to lure them into, groom them for some kind of improper behavior. But I think you're suggesting a broader education now about how do you evaluate what's real and what's not real and apply critical thinking. And that's something that we as citizens ought to learn how to do. Now, in terms of the government, obviously, there's a sensitivity because you have free speech, First Amendment, even if you don't like it. If RT puts out a story, whether or not they're an agent of the Russian government, there is a free speech element. But what are things that maybe social media can do or should do in terms of impersonation? When someone pretends to be a friend of somebody, or they conceal the fact that they're buying a political advertisement.
So on Twitter, we all have, if you're an elected official or a musician or someone, you get the little blue verified mark, right? Is there a way to say, listen, if you want to get some other kind of verification, to say that the name that pops up is indeed, somehow connected and attributed to somebody else? That's a possibility. You don't have to do it if you don't want to, but that would be a signal to a person using it. This person has gone through some kind of check to say they are indeed who they say they are. I think that's a very basic thing. Also, when it comes to political speech, the rules and regulations that have overseen and political speech is quite clear. And the same processes and restrictions that you have in print media should be the same things that you have in all media. And there's been a number of hearings on the Hill about this topic. Most everybody agrees on that. And we should be thinking about our political speech that way. Now, that doesn't mean the Russians are not going to try to do something to get around those issues, but not every not every Russian person involved in covert influence is Lex Luthor, right? And so we can defend against some, but we still have to have this broader whole of government's approach to countering that. And also, can we stop it at the beginning? You know, there's not enough information, not enough focus on this as a intelligence collection priority. Just like we would chase Russian intelligence officers or Iranian nuclear weapon proliferators, internet trolls, people that are trying to influence our democracy, I think that should move up the national priority intelligence framework.
Now, one of the things that we talked about earlier with Senator Cardin is that when we discuss Russian hybrid warfare or active measures, it's not just fake news. It involves a whole series of tools, which frankly they've used in Europe maybe more than they have here. That includes investing in companies and then using those investments as a way to leverage Russian interests. It involves using energy dominance as a way of leveraging, again, with respect to countries in Europe. It involves support for fringe political groups, including financial support. What are we seeing in terms of those kinds of efforts here? And whether or not we see them yet, what do we need to think about doing to counteract those as well?
Well, I think when you look at the use of companies to try to gain influence or political weight in the country, it's not just Russia. We also have to think about China on that. And one of the tools that we have is CFIUS. This is a review by a number of different federal agencies to ensure that whatever that investment is going to be doesn't have a national security implication. There's a lot of review on that process, and is it tight enough? One of the things that I've learned in my recent travels through Eastern Europe, I have a theorem that the closer you are to Russia, the less likely you are to believe their nonsense. But the converse of that rule is true too. The farther away you are, the more likely you are susceptible to.
Yeah, although take a look at Hungary. I mean, Hungary is quite close to Russia, and certainly Orban has been at best neutral as between the U.S. and Russia, and he's in many cases showed an inclination towards Russia. I mean, how do we work with our allies in Europe to make sure they don't wind up either through leverage or propaganda beginning to move into a different orbit?
Well, my NATO friends get mad when I say this, but some of the things I think is funny about NATO is if you're in a conflict with Russia, you're not allowed to be in NATO. Isn't that the people we want in NATO, right? And that precludes Ukraine. You know, Ukraine is, I believe, on the front line of this battle, and they not only are fighting a hybrid war, they're fighting a hot war. I think that's a perfect example of where the Russians get away with things. People are still talking about what's happening in Ukraine as a separatist movement. The 920 tanks that are in eastern Ukraine are Russian tanks. Right? And so the fact that anybody thinks this is something other than an invasion, and the fact that the Russians said we need the UN to arbitrate this, oh no, it's a real simple solution. Leave the country that you invaded. You know, that will solve that real quick. So we have to support these countries that are on the front lines, because the way they go, the way others go. Moldova. Moldova is a perfect example. The fact that the Russians were able to infiltrate certain provinces, run candidates, that were supportive of them to basically break away from Moldova. They're getting ready to go through an election in a few months. And the same kind of pressures that we saw in ours are going to be there, but you have all these added things like the influence of money and energy. That's why I'm excited about selling energy to Eastern Europe. Yeah. Because guess what? The Europeans would rather buy from us than Putin. Putin makes money from oil, but his political pressure comes from natural gas. And if we're able to break that, their influence in these regions are a little bit less, and you'll see some of these local folks less susceptible. So that's kind of getting outside of the area of disinformation. But these are some of the tactics that, again, Russia and Vladimir Putin is trying to do to reestablish that territorial integrity of the USSR.
So in 2015 and 2016, since you measured Ukraine, the lights went out in a certain part of Ukraine, and that's been attributed to a cyber attack that actually shut down some of the substations. And obviously, we focus here on our energy infrastructure and our other infrastructure. I know that in addition to your prior work, you're now involved with the Aspen, as one of the co-chairs of the Aspen Cybersecurity Group, which, full disclosure, I think I'm involved with as well. But how can we work with the private sector to make sure we're upping our defenses, not just against what we constantly see with theft of information, but actually with efforts that would interfere with our critical infrastructure?
And we have to start thinking of critical infrastructure as connected ecosystems, because one of the reasons you're going to do something on the utility grid is because that's going to impact the financial services industry as well. And so there aren't clear roles and responsibilities when it comes to cyber defense between the public and private sector. We talk a lot about information sharing, between the federal and between the government and the private sector. We got to clarify more, what information do you want to share, because not everybody is on the same level of sophistication as what information they need from the government. We need to be doing tabletop exercises on, if something were to happen and there were to be some active activity, what is everybody's role? We do that now when it was to respond to terrorist threats. Mm-hmm. We do that now to respond to natural disasters. I think the Hurricane Harvey in Texas was a good example of how all that preparation for about 10 years led to good execution on the end. We need to be having that same kind of mentality when it comes to a cyber attack on one of our critical infrastructure. But we also got to get ahead of the curve. You know, what I get frustrated in the federal government, we're thinking about, should we transition to the cloud? And we act like the cloud is new technology. The cloud's been around. The answer is yes. The answer is, why haven't we? But the future of cyber war is going to be good AI versus bad AI. And do we have the talents to deal with that future problem? Are we thinking about the strategies of what cyber warfare looks like between good AI and bad AI? And how do we stay number one in cryptology, quantum computing, artificial intelligence, machine learning? All of these are tools that we are going... There's a reason Vladimir Putin said, whoever masters AI is going to basically be the next hegemon. Right? Yeah. And so we know that's where they're going. We have an edge. Edge isn't our edge is not that great. Mm-hmm. We gotta separate from the pack. And so these are all things that, again, investment in basic research, applied research, people cooperating together. These are all of this matters in this broader being prepared for hybrid war with the Russians.
Great. Well, let me take some questions from the audience again to remind, if you identify yourself, we'll have people with microphones. Yes, over there, gentleman over there.
Hello. Mitchell Pullman. I've done a lot of work for the OSCE in Russia. I'd like to go back to a conversation we had earlier when Senator Cardin was here and the gentleman from the embassy, and the perception that's taken root amongst at least some of the Russian public that this is all part of an anti-Russian campaign brought about by the American political establishment. What can be done to counter that perception that would be effective, that wouldn't necessarily be viewed as still another propaganda campaign?
It's a hard issue to deal with, right? Traditionally, that is the public diplomacy role of our embassies abroad. Trying to do that public diplomacy role against, ultimately a hostile government is very difficult. I think, there have been debates here in the United States about cutting the budget for the State Department and USAID. I think that's crazy. My friend, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, always said that if you have more wingtips and pumps on the ground, you prevent boots on the ground, right? So basically saying, aggressive and strong diplomacy prevents having to bring a military in. Now, I'm not saying we're invading Russia, but we got to have a strong State Department, and one of their key responsibilities is that public diplomacy piece, right? You know, I can use Iran as an example, right? You know, I was saying we need to be supporting the Iranian people, not the Iranian government. And when we have these issues, we should make sure to separate the two. Because a lot of times we'll say, we got to stop Russia. No, we're trying to stop the Russian government, specifically Vladimir Putin's, you know, initiatives. And just something that simple and that distinction, I think matters. But this is a hard, I'm open to ideas. So if you have some, I know you've been following this, let me know.
Great. Yes, over here.
Thank you. I'm Amanda Brown from Brownstein Hyatt. You mentioned CFIUS earlier, and I was curious, and we have two bills, the Pittenger and Cornyn reform bills, that are picking up steam. To what extent do you believe that investment in our high-tech firms and social media platforms in particular poses a national security threat that should be subject to a CFIUS review?
I think when it comes to the CFIUS review, we have to be able to do a deeper dive in knowing who is ultimately the person that is getting involved, right? And so it's like in any deal, due diligence matters, right? I don't care what kind of the deal is. And so I think the due diligence part, we need to be a little bit more aggressive. And so that would be, you know, and I don't care what the industry is, right? I think, you know, yes, we focus, CFIUS is primarily focused around high tech, but you know, you can get into the back door a number of different ways. You can do things when it comes to commercial real estate and start building a presence. You know, this is, we should be thinking about all of those kinds of investments, and we should be making sure that we have the due diligence. And when the government plays a role, I think we can streamline and improve the due diligence that we do on some of those investments.
Yes, gentleman over here.
Here, Congressman. David Salvo. I'm a fellow here at the Alliance for Security and Democracy. There are millions of Americans across the country, including in districts like yours, I imagine, who don't accept that Russian interference and hybrid warfare are threats to American national security. Or even if they do accept it, it's not immediately tangible to them, so they don't pay much attention to what we're doing here in Washington to defend against it. So my question is, how do we take the conversation we're having here in Washington today and bring it to the broader American public to get their buy-in for what we're trying to do, what you're trying to do, what Congress and the administration are trying to do to defend against this threat?
I will say there's a lot of folks in South and West Texas that are ready for the Red Dawn event, right? So we're ready. We're ready. It starts with talking about it, right? And that's what I try to do. You know, everybody. I talk about IT procurement when I go back in my district. Trust me, that is not a sexy topic, and nobody has ever held a parade for that. But it requires conversations like this to articulate what the problem is. When you look at national security, I don't care what district you go to, you know, national security is usually a number 2, number 3 issue. And so for us that are having these conversations, defining this as a national security concern and explain the why. A lot of times for those that you've been doing this for a long time, you know, we take certain things for granted. We always have to continue to make the case of what is this threat to us. And I think this latest example we saw within our elections is a good test case. The specific example that I believe Senator Burr used in the hearings with the social media companies of what happened in Texas between what looked like a black nationalist group and a Southern, you know, pride group. You know, that I think is a perfect example of what the Russians are trying to do to go from cyberspace into the real world. And the more we can highlight what the problem is, and then in that, we always have to go back to that so everybody knows the importance of this. It's hard.
Okay. Gentleman back there.
Hi there, Congressman. Mike Memoli with NBC News. We just heard from Senator Cardin discussing what he said he hopes will be received as a bipartisan or even nonpartisan report, but obviously it was one that was written only by Democrats. You sit on the House Intelligence Committee. I think it might be an understatement to say there's been some political friction in how your own Russia probe has been going. Can you give us an update and talk about what you hope to be able to produce in terms of the House Intelligence Committee's probe? And related in some ways to the last question, what would you say to the average American who looks at things like we saw yesterday with the release of the Simpson transcript unilaterally and some of these other fights that have been happening in terms of oversight and wonder whether our government is able to tackle these issues in a bipartisan way?
So I do believe our government can tackle these issues in a bipartisan way. We have to, in order to ensure that the American people have trust in what is being done up here. My goal is what we've always stated, is, what exactly did the Russians do, what was the government response to that, and what should the government response have been, and because I want us to look further into the future of how do we set up to prepare for this into the future. So let's agree on some of those tactics that were being used, and I think there is bipartisan support on that. I think, sometimes some of your colleagues want to focus on one thing that may have been said in order to show that division. But I will say in some of these, the meetings and the hearings and things that I'm in, there is a bipartisan support to make sure we get to the bottom of this. But the area where we need more conversation around is what we started this conversation with. Mm-hmm. What is the national strategy to deal with counter disinformation? And there's not been enough conversation on that. I know that the national security staff and council is talking about this and trying to develop this. But that I think, because when we can put in place a strategy that I think Republicans and Democrats will agree on, then we can make sure everybody knows that we're trying to prevent this problem from happening in the future.
Lady in the back.
Hi, I'm Clara Tao. I work for the Interagency Countering Violent Extremism Task Force, heading up their digital strategy team. I loved your comment earlier about really combining thought leadership, especially from lessons learned from CVE, into broader political disinformation. My question is, there's a lot of duplicative efforts that I've seen in the past. We've seen the Global Engagement Center, really look at disinformation alongside terrorist propaganda. But how can we have more alignment in working together, specifically when it comes to actions on the Hill? There's been several meetings incredibly duplicative with the tech sector and with a number of partners in this space. And I think a lot of people haven't necessarily gotten there and seeing those parallels.
Well, look, it starts with what this organization is trying to do. How do we catalog all the different folks that are already involved in this effort? I'll be honest, I don't know who's all involved in this activity, and a lot of things are popping up. And so when it comes to a major problem, having a little overlap is not necessarily a bad thing, right? But we do need to start moving to a streamlined organization. It starts with what is that strategy? Who's responsible for it? And once you know who's responsible for it and you have a strategy, then you can start making sure everybody understands what their roles and responsibilities are. It is unclear because we don't have an overarching plan on how to deal with this. And it's not just in the government, but it has to be a public-private cooperation. And we're trying to do that at the Aspen Institute on cybersecurity, because I think more people have gotten used to how you handle cybersecurity, but disinformation is still kind of a nebulous issue for people. CVE is still nebulous, even though that's probably been around a lot longer than this notion of disinformation. And so we have to figure out who's in charge and come up with a plan, and then everybody can figure out what their role is. And these are some of the conversations that both the House and the Senate are trying to have. I think the publication of this report is a helpful narrative to push that, and so that we can start focusing on, okay, for 2018, this is how we're going to be prepared.
Yes, over here.
Very much. So to continue this theme of combating disinformation, we've been listening to the wonderful presenters here, thank you, talk about how...
Just identify yourself.
Oh, sorry, Christine Vargas, Civic Engagement Fund. Thank you. We've been watching a lot of propaganda come out of Russia aimed at its own people to ensure they're behind what Putin's doing.
Yeah.
What would you recommend that U.S. leaders do for similar efforts here in the United States? For example, we've got Sinclair Broadcast Group putting out basically video op-eds that are extremely divisive, xenophobic, and are not actually news. And while they don't fall afoul of FEC regulations, they still are causing problems that help people be more susceptible to fake news, vote a certain way, and not in a way that's going to help us focus on the real issues like we're discussing here. So what would you recommend to deal with that?
Well, I don't know if I would categorize Sinclair and Vladimir Putin in the same conversation, but look, I think there's a great book called The Red Web,
yeah.
which was written by hackers, some Russian hackers is probably the best way to say it, about how Vladimir Putin basically was able to control not just the outlets for social media, but the broader media in general. And that is kind of the playbook, and you see that. I would say what's great about the other thing that's great about this, the reason we're having this problem is there's so many vehicles to get information out, right? And so, you know, it's hard to hide when you have everybody in different organizations like many of y'all here that are shining a light on these problems. And so we have to continue to encourage that. But you're absolutely right with what the Russian government is trying to do and influence their own people in order to keep Putin in charge. You know, the discounting of this gentleman, I'm drawing a blank on his name, who was probably one of the leading opposition figures and saying he can't run for president.
Oh, Navalny?
Yeah, you know, that this is, you know, that's crazy that we're allowing this to happen. You know, the fact that Russia is doubling down on some of the oppressive regimes in Iran and Syria. You know, we need we can't do this alone, and we need our European allies to follow suit and support us on the shining a light to these practices that's happening in Russia, and it requires many of y'all to do that as well. And let's encourage and let's support our allies like Moldova. Let's encourage and participate with the Ukrainians. These are all important things for us to also do.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
Very much, David Bakradze, Ambassador of Georgia. Very nice to meet you.
And Georgia as well. So
Yes.
I apologize for it. I apologize.
Thank you. This year is actually 10 years since the invasion of Russia to Georgia, and since then we are trying to minimize the space where Russia can continue and infiltrate. We are number one reformer with regards to the fighting of corruption. We are in the Eastern Europe and Central Asia by the World Bank. We are, trying to become as transparent as possible as a government. We're a leader of the open government partnership in the world. But this year is also the 10 years of the promise that Georgia will become the NATO member. Through that optics, how do you see the possibility of, nevertheless, despite these reforms, now we face 8,000 Russian troops standing on the Georgian soil. So do you see the response towards that through strengthening allies, partners like Georgia, and in bilateral, but also in the multilateral, which regards the Euro-Atlantic aspiration of the countries? Thank you.
If I was able to make the decision, we'd have a whole lot more friends in NATO. And unfortunately, I think sometimes they have, how do I be diplomatic, outdated understanding and models on how they can be helpful. But guess what? The U.S. should still make sure that we're supporting our friends. And we're supporting the folks that are on the front line. And Georgia is on the front line. Moldova is on the front line. There's so many other places that are on the front line. And again, it goes back to the gentleman's question in the back. We have to explain to the American people why what happens in Georgia is important for our national security. And and that is something that folks like here in this room, like the Secretary, being able to make that case of why supporting you is important for the folks in South and West Texas or Iowa or Ohio. So you have my vote, but if there's other things we can be doing and should be doing, we'd love to see you.
Great. Well, listen, Congressman, it's been a great conversation, and by the way, a great illustration of bipartisanship, because both of you came out basically in the same place. And, you know, when we deal with adversaries, we're Americans rather than party members, and so we have to remember that. And this is the beginning of a discussion, not the end, but thank you very much for joining us. Thanks a lot.